opioids are part of what this book talks about. But I want you to know that I also talk about things that some of you may be familiar with and some may have never heard about. I have a chapter on something called orphan drugs. You say, orphan what? Orphan drugs are the most expensive drugs in the world. If you take the top 10 most expensive drugs in the world today, 9 of them are orphan drugs. And it was actually started in the early 1980s. Just give you the quick overview. US government passed a law that said to drug companies, by the way, there are these rare genetic diseases. Some of them affect only a few hundred people. So drug companies weren't spending any time looking at them because there wasn't enough money. The market wasn't big enough. So the government gave them incentives. It said, we'll give you an extra 7-year easy patent. You'll get through the FDA approval process faster. We'll liberalize the rules. We'll give you tax credits. We'll give you tax incentives, all types of things. And as a result, pharmaceutical companies started to develop these drugs, and they marketed them at very high prices. The problem is that the system has been gamed repeatedly. Now the drug companies know how to game the system in ways the original law never intended. They get multiple approvals for the same drugs. They get approvals for drugs that later become mass generic popular drugs. And if you read that particular chapter on orphan drugs, you'll realize that it's something that should be corrected tomorrow by the United States Congress, but it's not, because both parties, Republicans and Democrats, are beholden to the drug industry in too many ways. I have another chapter on what's called PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers. They turn out to be unique to the United States. They originally started out in the 1980s also as sort of almost what I call payroll processing companies. So they went out to drug companies just at the time managed care came in and insurance. So now you have insurance starting to grow, independent insurance. So people at work would have their own insurance policies, and each insurance policy covered something different. You had to apply to see how much of your deductible applied and what your levels were. So these companies came out and they said to big corporate America, Fortune 500 companies, you don't want to process all this paperwork with insurance companies for your employees on the medical claims. We'll do it. We'll be like payroll processors. So that's all they were. But then they became, over time, multi-billion-dollar companies. I mean, we know them today as CVS, as Caremark, as, if you think of the size of them, these are companies literally that have United Health's Optum RX, Express Scripts, and they've become far more than just payroll processors. These are companies that eventually formed the formularies for which drugs would be accepted under your insurance plan. So sometimes you have to look to see if the particular drug you have, if you're on Medicare, for instance, you have a prescription D policy, is your drug covered under the formulary? Guess what? That decision is not made necessarily by the insurance company. It's not made by the pharmaceutical company. It's made by these bureaucrats called pharmacy benefit managers. Even the pharmacist, who's the retail pharmacist at the end of the line, doesn't know how the process takes place except for one thing: rebates. So drug companies will say to the pharmacy benefit managers, by the way, we'll pay you a rebate on every prescription written for this particular drug to treat hypertension, not because it's the best of the drugs, not because it's the cheapest of the drugs available, but because it's the drug we're going to give you a rebate on. And PBMs will put that drug on the formulary. You, as a layperson, the consumer, think it's on the formulary because it must be the best of the drugs. It's there because the PBM is making millions and millions of dollars from having placed it there. And the key part is they don't have to disclose it to anyone. Under the current law, there's no requirement that makes them disclose publicly in a database the rebates that they get from drug companies. That's a disgrace. The last thing I talk about in the second last chapter, the coming pandemic. And that the first chapter in the book is called Patient Zero. It's about a woman in her 70s who catches a bacterial infection, an intestinal infection that should not be lethal. It's an infection that came from India. She had traveled to India before this. And in a hospital in Reno, Nevada, they start to treat her with antibiotics. It's basically gone under the radar, this case. It did not get a lot of press. And they finally treat her with every known antibiotic approved by the US FDA and available. And none of them worked, and she died. She's the first patient to die of antibiotic resistance. Antibiotic resistance has grown since the 1950s and 60s when antibiotics were discovered. They were overprescribed. Doctors gave them from sore ears to sniffles to everything that you walked into the office for without determining you really had a bacterial infection. As a result, people built up a resistance to them. We've added them to the water supply. We spray crops, as I talk about in Florida, the citrus crops with streptomycin. We have them being used on regular crops, on plant crops. They are used on cattle and in the food supply. In tests in England in the 1970s, even children who didn't drink milk or were lactose intolerant had levels of antibiotics that they had picked up from just the food supply. So this is a problem across the board. It creates antibiotic resistance. And the fear of physicians is pharmaceutical companies have stopped making new antibiotics. Why? Money. Because they used to be in the business of making antibiotics, and then they decided, hey, why should we make antibiotics? We spend all this money making them. They're only good for 5 to 7 days. You get a short treatment, maybe 3 days in some cases. And doctors don't use the latest and greatest antibiotic. They use an old one because they want to give the new one to create antibiotic resistance. So they left the field to come up with drugs for chronic diseases, hypertension, migraines, blood pressure, sugar, things like that, where somebody could take a pill every day for the rest of their life. It's much more profitable. As a result, we have fewer antibiotics at a time when antibiotic resistance is growing. And if the pandemic we're now facing, which is viral, was instead bacterial, like the Black Plague had been, if it was a bacteria that was jumping from one species to another and spreading as a bacterial infection, and we needed an antibiotic to fight it, the antibiotics that we had, we were resistant to, we would really be in a race to try to save the planet. So you talk about potential risk that we are at with not being prepared. We're not prepared in part because the pharmaceutical industry has decided not to look into antibiotics because there's not enough money there, and they should be encouraged to do so. So I want to sum up in the sense that I've given you this sort of, brief background in the history of the business, touched on a few things like opioids and orphan drugs and pharmacy benefit managers and the lack of antibiotics and the profits inside the industry. There's a lot to cover. And all I want to say is I want to thank you very, very much, not only for coming to listen to me this morning, but having the patience to stay through and to listen to this lecture, and hopefully you'll have some questions and I'll have some answers for you as we go along and discuss it. Some of you may be interested in looking at the book eventually, but I will guarantee you that if you do, it will be a resource and reference book that at times will raise your blood pressure, because there are some infuriating stories in it when it comes to public health and profit in the pharmaceutical industry. Thank you very much for being such an attentive group.